Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Welcome to the latest in our bite-sized webinar. I'm thrilled to be joined by Steve Brockway to talk about all things CX in a post-COVID world. I've got a couple of housekeeping things just before we move on. You've all been put into listening mode as part of the webinar today, but we would love to hear your questions. So if you do have anything that you'd like to ask us, please just pop it in the chat window and we'll do our best to answer your queries. If not as part of the session today, then definitely we'll be reaching out after the session. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Steve, who's our Chief Research Officer here at Maru Matchbox UK. Steve, over to you.
Hi everyone, as Mel said, my name's Steve Brockway. I'm Chief Research Officer at Maru Matchbox UK. And my role really is to help our clients and new clients get maximum value from their customer experience programs, ensuring they're using the full suite of our capabilities and research know-how.
Great, Steve, thank you. And Steve and I have worked together for a number of years. My name's Melanie Lewis. I head up our business development team and that have worked in the business across a number of CX programs. So this is something that's really close to my heart. And I think over the last few weeks and months, Steve and I have been having a lot of discussions as clients and prospective clients have been talking to us about different things that they might need to consider to evolve their approach to CX and CX generally within the business as the situation has kind of evolved and changed around us. And so before we kind of dig into some of those questions, I guess one thing that immediately sprung to mind as we were preparing for the session today is just really how important it is to understand how we make decisions and how we rationalize our experiences. And the way that we like to think about this, the framework that we've put in place, is really around a kind of three-pillar approach. So we absolutely recognize in these times where emotion is so changeable, but also so important, that it's really essential that you understand how experiences are making your customers feel, as well as what they think about them and what they're actually doing through them. And so I know, Steve, we've got some questions that kind of align around this. So really keen to jump into those and kind of hear more about your experience. So first of all, I guess it is fair to say that everything has changed, certainly since the beginning of the year. So I guess the kind of million-dollar question, Steve, is, what should CX and insight professionals be thinking about right now in terms of making sure that they're talking the right language and really elevating the voice of the customer within their businesses?
Sure, thanks, Mel. Well, one thing we can be sure of, it's a challenging time for everyone, as we've all had to adapt and learn how to operate in the new normal. So what should we be asking now and thinking now is a really good question to start off with. As always, I believe the first place to start is with the most important aspect, the customer. As a business, you need to understand how your customer experience has changed. Ask yourself, what have you had to do to ensure customers and your staff stay safe and feel safe? We also suggest walking in the customer's shoes and experiencing this for yourself. You will then better understand what impact any changes have had on your customer journeys and any individual touch points within them. For example, some of the retailers we work with have moved stock from their stores, from their shops, into their online channels over lockdown to ensure they can fulfill the increase in online demand. But this may mean limited availability in physical stores. So really needs a plan for when shops have reopened. And some outlets in the hospitality sector have limited their menus to account for fewer tables and safety measures. So you really need to understand how your experience has changed. So having evaluated how any changes impact your customer journeys, you must ensure you set customer expectations. And this is so important. If you don't set customer expectations, people will simply not tolerate the inconveniences. We've seen in our COVID tracker that we've run for many weeks now that people are very understanding and will adapt to the new normal, but need to have expectations set with clear reasons why. If you fail to understand how your experience has changed and don't set customer expectations, then you will have an expectation gap. This will lead to tension and poor experience ratings. Just one last point, Mel. I think Having actually done this exercise, if your customer experience has changed, and it's likely to have, then don't be obsessed with metrics to begin with, as they won't be comparable to previous years anyway. Take a test and learn approach for a month or two, or maybe a few weeks. This is because in the short term, the granular feedback itself is far more important than the metrics. What are your customers feeling and thinking? Are there any hotspots within the new normal that can be quickly identified and resolved? Is that okay,
No,
Mel?
that's great. Yeah, no, absolutely, Stephen. I think if I'm hearing you rightly, I think really what we're saying and what we're observing, I guess, within some of the programs that we run is that, you know, it's never been more important to understand really the kind of granular. So not just observing, as you say, the trends in scores and kind of the changes in metrics, but really getting to know your customers now, like what is their expectation now, because chances are it's completely evolved from kind of the beginning of the year. And I think the kind of point that you had around kind of understanding that and being able to action that based on customer comments or verbatims that you've got coming through, and you know, that's really great for the short term, like it's full of richness. But I guess my follow-up question is actually, what about the longer term? So where things like metrics have played a bigger role in terms of setting targets and things along those lines, like what should we be thinking about now that will help us prepare for that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So thinking longer term, if you have set or want to set targets, which many people do, we accept that, particularly for key metrics, then we would recommend using an initial trial period to recalibrate your CX scores. Understand how the year-on-year scores have changed and establish if any target needs to be reset in the context of what you are seeing, because we are in a new normal, so you need to understand what's changed. The key point here is that if a target is not seen as being meaningful by your teams, it will cause disengagement. So be very mindful of this and be prepared to take action if needed. There's nothing wrong with having targets per se, so long as these are bought into by your people and seen as something that teams can move the dial on. I think just one other point here to your question, Mel, is to use your CX programs to help your business make informed decisions at speed. And I think speed is so important in the current climate. This is about having the right culture internally to activate change. Ensure that cross-functional teams, both in the centre and at customer-facing locations, are aligned and have clear and open channels of communication. As in this new normal, I believe the most successful will be those companies that are agile enough to listen and act at speed and adapt to the new ways of working.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. And I think in the past, maybe that kind of action at speed has been kind of heavily skewed towards technology and knowing that you can get that data into the business quickly. But actually, it's as much about having a culture that can act upon it and kind of mobilize and, you know, like you say, drive action across the business. And I guess one thing that COVID has kind of illustrated is that businesses can do it. Like businesses have performed great feats of kind of changing operationally as well as culturally to you know, really make people feel safe on the ground. So I think maybe we've raised the bar in terms of what people expect. So it'd be really interesting to see that play out. And so you mentioned a couple of times, Steve, around kind of understanding the granular experience. And I guess I just wanted to build on that in terms of the emotional mindset. And I know through the tracking work that we've done, like there's been huge change week on week, particularly in the types of concerns that people have. And what should we be thinking about here? How can we weave CX and emotion more closely together?
I think that's great, because emotion is something that gets left behind, but it's so important. Emotion should never be underestimated, and even more so in the current climate. The fundamental basic human needs of safety have been challenged in the current climate, so people feel vulnerable and anxious. We've actually undertaken some digital qualitative research and used System 1 techniques to understand this new paradigm. I think one example here is face coverings, which certainly for the UK is going to become more apparent in coming days. Our research has shown that because masks hide facial expressions, this at best causes uncertainty, and at worst means customers can't read non-verbal facial cues. This actually could be an issue for those in the service sector, given the key non-verbal communication just of a simple smile may not be possible, so you really need to understand that. Now, using traditional research to ask people how they feel simply isn't going to cut it, because it's a difficult question to ask, let alone answer, as people are either unable or unwilling to say how they feel. To do this, you need to engage people in the way they make decisions. And I think this is so important. Use techniques that unlock fast System 1 responses. Behavioural science has proved that 95% of our decisions are driven by fast, intuitive System 1 part of our brain. So we've developed a number of capabilities that utilise images and reaction time to bypass rational responses and reveal a pathway to your customer's true System 1 response. This allows you to understand which areas are most emotive for your customer. Back to you, Mel.
That's great, Steve. You know what's coming next. That all sounds great, but how do we make it actionable?
Yes, that's a good point. I think it's always good to have some real life examples. So I've got two quick real life examples here. I think firstly, at the start of lockdown, we did use one of our System 1 tools to reveal how people wanted brands and companies to behave. And this revealed they needed reassurance, but most of all, understanding from companies in times of uncertainty. Companies that didn't understand this emotional need actually went quiet and stopped communicating, which we believe was a mistake, whereas others stood up and were counted. One example here is Expedia, who automatically switched their customers to flexible booking options, something that would have been to have to pay a premium for. But they took that decision guided by their brand values of putting themselves in the customer's shoes and say, as a brand, how can we provide reassurance? I think another good example of understanding emotion is how to drive improvement. And in some recent work we did with a client who was actually struggling to move the dial on their CX metrics, what we actually did is we took the customer experience and we understood it was about how you feel, not just what you think, and can't be measured by traditional metrics. So using one of our unique System 1 techniques, we revealed that the emotional signature, what is actually the emotional essence of the experience of those scoring a 9 or a 10, was completely different to those scoring a 7 or an 8. Just 1 point on a scale, but miles apart in terms of emotional connection. This new insight actually unlocked an emotional pathway of how to meaningfully connect with customers and drive those higher scores that they were seeking.
Absolutely, Steve. Thank you. And so I guess the next question that I have is, and we've talked about it a little bit, is really how you can engage the business. Now, I know we've been talking a lot about kind of how vital people are, and I think definitely where you're trying to engage and trying to build on those emotional cues, really it's people talking to people is the easiest way to do it. But how can we engage business in CX right now? Like, where are our hints and tips for this?
Yeah, I think engagement is going to be key, particularly amongst your workforce, as there's a lot of health as well as job security uncertainty. I think a CX program is only as good as the engagement it generates within your business. And as a business, we strongly believe that. Successful programs create a listen and act culture by ensuring cross-functional teams are focused on the customer and build synergy through a customer-centric approach. We think, firstly, at this time of uncertainty, like I said earlier, both with health risks and increased job security that we're seeing in the news every day, it's more important than ever to have a clear and open communication lines to create a culture that can listen and act at speed. The long-term winners here will be brands and companies that can adapt to the new normal in a way that shows empathy and understanding with their staff. They'll be remembered as the heroes rather than the villains. I think one more area I just want to mention here regarding staff and colleagues is something we've successfully done with some of our clients. This is where we run both a customer and a staff panel in parallel with their CX program. So you can effectively create a room full of staff where you can continually temperature check new initiatives, collaborate on new ideas, and even co-create. Now remember, your customer-facing staff are at the operational sharp end, so they will often have the best solutions to issues within your business. And we've developed a solution called Smart Loops that creates a process of continuous improvement by identifying hotspot issues in your CX program, sharing these with your staff through our staff panel, and generating ideas on how best to resolve issues. And these best ideas can then be trialled and monitored in your CX program to see if they are delivering, and then adopted and rolled out after a test period. And you could even use this as a source of staff recognition by rewarding colleagues who have made suggestions that have made a tangible improvement to the customer experience. And recognising people can go a long way to improving the culture and letting staff see that your CX program is about driving better experiences rather than just monitoring scores.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, Steve. And I think I've been personally involved in a couple of those colleague versus customer kind of panels, and they're brilliant, not just for the kind of co-creation of those solutions, but also to kind of get people involved from a really early stage and embed the ownership of some of those solutions. They're a really great tool. I'm conscious of time. We could obviously talk much longer for on this topic. I know it's something that we're both passionate about. I guess the final question that I have is really around kind of our key learnings. So what have we learned? I appreciate that the learning curve has been really steep, but what are our kind of key takeouts in terms of those learnings?
Yeah. I think as I gave a nod to at the start of this session, this has been a challenging time for all businesses, and we understand that. We've been speaking to our clients, and it has been a challenge as they adapt to the new normal. So the first and most important point we would say here is don't stop listening to your customers, as even in times of crisis, people want their voice to be heard more than ever. In the CX programs that we run, and we actually ran some proprietary research here as well, both the volume of responses and the response rates increased significantly over the peak of the pandemic. Even when some businesses were effectively under lockdown and were completely shut down, this proves that people wanted to have their views heard more than ever. And our emotional analysis revealed people seek reassurance in times of crisis and need brands to use their values and sweet spots to provide this. If you choose not to listen or communicate, then you will leave an emotional vacuum with your customers that risk being filled by negative emotions, which will ultimately erode your brand equity. I think lastly, one final key learning here is that when you cannot trade, how you deal with impacted customers will drive your future customer relationships. Just look at the airline and travel sector, which I think is a good example here, with different brands taking very diverging approaches. While some brands have effectively shut down communication channels, others have embraced impacted customers, looking through the customer's eyes, showing empathy and responding in an understanding way. They are focused on the lifetime value rather than the single transaction. And we believe, who do you think is going to win in the long term here? It will be the brands that build lasting emotional bonds with customers.
That's great, Steve. Thank you. And I think I can see we've got a couple of questions coming through. I guess in terms of the kind of sharing of some of these experiences, I know that we've been working really closely with clients to make sure that that's proportionate and that we're getting information out. Have we got anything else around kind of the sharing of trials, I guess, if we're responding at speed and getting that information back into clients? Have we got any examples on that?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that earlier now that speed is really important here. It's about speed and adaptability. The most agile businesses will succeed here. And we work with our clients to ensure they share both failure and success quickly and loudly. And I think that's a really important point here. An open culture of sharing will mean you identify and tackle issues quicker. An example of how you can create this open culture is by both celebrating when things go well, but also acting and freeing up your staff to quickly resolve issues by using staff communities and sharing best practice. Now, multi-site organisations always want to know what's working elsewhere. So I think there's lots of opportunities to share what different parts of the organisation are doing, and even where they're demonstrating excellence. My advice is share it loud and share it fast, because then you'll be a fast-moving and adapting business.
Brilliant, Steve. Thank you. And I think on that note, we're out of time, unfortunately. I can see that there's a few other questions coming through, so thank you all for your input. We'll be sure to kind of get back in touch with you over the upcoming days. And if there's anything that kind of springs to mind that you haven't had a chance to kind of raise, or that you would like to hear our point of view on, then please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. But for this afternoon, for this webinar, it's goodbye from me, and I'm sure cheerio from Steve. Thanks ever so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.